Welcome to session 9 of God is Merciful, Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through 41. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater Jonah is here. I'll keep going. The queen of the south will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. For today, we will focus on verses 38 through 41. The sign of the prophet Jonah. Though the book of Jonah ended without a concrete conclusion, Jesus used Jonah's story as a sign. You may be wondering, what sign could we possibly learn from a man who felt he was justified in his own way? How could someone who was in direct opposition to God be used as a sign by Jesus Christ? Well, in this lesson, we will go over all of that. But first, consider this point. Not all testimonies consist of you receiving a blessing or God doing something good on your behalf. A testimony is defined as a formal statement, usually given as evidence or proof that something is real or true, those types of things. In the biblical context, we associate the sharing of our testimony with telling someone how we came to know God. That is a great way to look at it. But I would challenge that it is a one-sided view. When we testify of our blessings, we are giving proof that God is real and that he makes good on his promises. On the other hand, when we tell how the Lord dealt with us in our disobedience, we are testifying that God is a good father ready to correct the hearts of his children. Either way, we are proving the realness of God. Keep this in mind as we go through Matthew 12, verses 38 through 41. Verse 38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. When we meet up with Jesus here, he had already been questioned by some of the Pharisees and scribes. They were policing his disciples for picking grain on the Sabbath. They questioned Jesus for healing on the Sabbath and even had the nerve to ask by whose authority was he able to do so. Jesus, knowing their hearts, began to call them out. He used an analogy of a tree and its fruit to make the point that you are either going to produce good fruit or bad, but you cannot keep pretending to be good only to produce evil. What's even more interesting is that Jesus, starting in verse 36, says this: every idle word that a man speaks, he shall give an account for in the day of judgment. For by your words you shall be justified, and by your words you shall be condemned. This is interesting because it is after this statement that the group begins to question Jesus and demand a sign of proof that he was of God, all while calling him master or teacher. Let's keep reading. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. This is our main text for today. Within this verse, Jesus says, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah or Yonah. Evil. That's the word used here. That word is one who is evil in the sense of causing pain and trouble, one who brings toils and annoyance, or one who is of a bad nature or condition. Adulterous, those who relapse into idolatry, faithless to God. Remember how we discussed that Jonah was left with an open-ended question on purpose? Now we are seeing here in this text why it may have been left open. Ask yourself, where do I fall in relation to this story? Am I guilty of policing God's move? Verse 40. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus reference of Jonah being in the belly of the fish as a sign of God's pending move was symbolic of the resurrection Jesus was about to experience from the grave. Going back to the discussion on whether or not Jonah's story was fact or fiction, here, Jesus is making it clear to them. If you have a hard time believing that story, then you will struggle to believe I've been raised up again when the time comes. Another point this reference made is this: even after Jonah was resurrected from his own watery grave, he still felt justified to withhold the mercy of God from a people he felt were undeserving. Jesus is making a statement here that God is not just the God of the righteous or the self-righteous. He is the God of all mankind. In verse 41, the men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here. Let's go back to that again. The people of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation, the evil and adulterous one, the self-righteous generation. And shall condemn it. Why? Because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. Jesus made it clear that he, a greater Jonah, a greater messenger of God, a prophet, a dove, is here. Let that sink in. The ones who were once the chosen people of God are now being called evil and adulterous, while the Gentiles, those quote unquote unchosen ones, are being noticed for the repentant hearts. The religious ones questioned Jesus while the unchurched welcomed him. The religious questioned Jesus. They questioned his validity. They questioned his realness. They questioned his move. Why are you doing this? What proof are you doing this? Who told you you could do this? Meanwhile, the unchurched welcomed him. Let that sink in. Not only will they rise up in the day of judgment, but they will also condemn the religious ones. God is merciful. A common phrase spoken is, do to others as you would have them do to you. Matthew 7, verse 12. But have we considered the weight of these words? Jonah was fine being a recipient of the Lord's mercy as long as it benefited him. However, he had a problem with it when the recipient didn't meet his standards. That recipient is the very one God says will rise up in the day of judgment and condemn them. By your words, you will be justified, and by your words, you shall be condemned. The very words you use to justify your religious hardness will be the very words you use to condemn you in the day of judgment. Partial application of the law of God gave Moses the law of God would have you self-righteous to the point of your own demise. Sorry, I lost my space there. Partial application of the law of God will have you self-righteous to the point of your own demise. Exodus 20, verse 6, when the Lord gave Moses the commandment to not make any graven images of God and bow down to it, Exodus 20, verse 4, he also gave an explanation as to why. That explanation concludes with God through Moses making it known that he will show mercy unto thousands who love him and keep his commandments. Never does the Lord say that his mercy is only for the chosen. He said that he would show mercy to those who love him and keep his commandments. Be careful not to speak of another person's unworthiness of God's mercy, because by doing so, you assert yourself as though you know better than God and put yourself in direct opposition to God's heart. That's all for this session. Join us for our last session next time as we conclude God is merciful. Discussion questions. How does the use of Jonah's actions as a sign resonate within you? How does Matthew 12, verses 38 through 41 help you to understand God's purpose for including the book of Jonah in the Bible? Have you ever done something that the Lord could use as proof of what not to do or how not to respond? In this session, the traditional use of the word testimony in the modern day church was said to be one-sided. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Please explain your answer. Again, join me back here for session 10 as we conclude God is merciful. Bye.